If revelations of a rogue administration wiretapping Americans, dodging questions about misuse of national security resources to spy on political opponents, raises the specter of another presidential rogue, Richard Nixon, this is no coincidence. As a low-level veteran of the Nixon administration, Dick Cheney came away with the moral that Nixon failed to go far enough in claiming the state is me, and set about, therefore, to claim as much power for the executive branch as he possibly could in the Bush administration. How then to undo the unconstitutional, unpatriotic excesses of the equivalent of Nixon 2.0? Joining us now with his unique vantage point on that question is the man who served as Nixon's White House counsel and more recently author of Worse Than Watergate and Broken Government, John Dean. John, welcome back, as always.
Thank you, Keith.
You heard Congressman Cohen just now. We mentioned David Criss returning to DOJ, noted opponent of the warrantless wiretapping. Does this tell us anything about whether we're going to get any facts, let alone whether or not anybody's going to wind up doing jail time?
Well, it certainly tells us we have a professional in charge. David came up through the system, then was appointed to a high-level post, had problems with the Bush administration, was very outspoken. So he's somebody who obviously is going to let the law proceed where it should and do the right thing. So I think we all should be quite comfortable in that appointment, and we'll see what happens.
Well, what about the notion that I raised with Congressman Cohen here that some members of Congress might have known, at least to some degree, how widespread this was long before our friend Mr. Tice said anything about it the last two nights? How would they possibly, theoretically, have known, and how could this affect the investigation, if any, as it goes forward?
Keith, I would be shocked if they hadn't been briefed. This is sort of standard operating procedure by presidents in national security areas. They'll say the Intel Committee itself would be, as well as some of the leadership could have well been briefed. Presidents do this really to cover their own behind, if you will, and Nixon is a classic example of doing it. So they're also told it's national security and they can't talk about it. And they wouldn't talk about it unless they were released from that classified status.
I found maybe the most fascinating and the simplest part of Mr. Tice's story was the idea that to get some of these programs, the component programs, past the relevant oversight bodies in Congress. If it was a committee that dealt with defense, they'd meet in private session beforehand and say this was all approved by the State Department. If it was a committee that dealt with state, they'd meet in advance and say this was already approved in secret by the Defense Department. You can't ask any questions about this. Could the shell game of keeping this secret to some degree from at least the rank and file in Congress really have been that easy?
I'm afraid it could be. First of all, when you're in this very gray area of national security, members of Congress have nothing to push against. Unless the information is given to them, there's no way they really can get it. So I think this is a classic example of a shell game that's been used to deceive the Congress.
What happens if the president lets this slide, or if Congress does, in fact, do nothing about this, or has, as we have discussed before,